At least we got the system online, so that's good. First thing we want to do is go to the device list and check the firmware. And it just runs through scanning the GX device, the servo in this case, for all the devices attached, and we found two. We've got the solar charger. We need to update that firmware. Just goes through basically and does the firmware update. Sometimes it will require two firmware updates for a blue solar charge controller, or you know, the MPPTs. Depends how old the original firmware is. It has to do it in two steps sometimes. Cool. So that's done. It'll rescan it. Yep, there we go. And it needs to go a second step on that. Oh, maybe not. Oh, it's refreshed saying it's up to date, so that's good. So I'll just refresh that page. Takes a while if the internet connection's a bit dodgy, but seems to get there in the end. All right, now we update the inverter. Now this asks you to go through a whole lot of rules. Just make sure that you read these rules if you're going to update an inverter. The main thing is it wipes the program on the inverter, so you have to reprogram it. This is a brand new install, so it doesn't really matter. We're going to program it anyway. There has to be, you know, certain, like if you've got an AC inverter in there, you have to turn that off if it's AC coupled. Because it wipes the program, it won't frequency shift to ramp back an AC coupled inverter, which means it could overcharge the batteries if it's off grid. The GX device is not powered by the inverter, it's powered by the battery. So that means the power to the GX will stay on when the inverter turns off. Basically, you really want to do this with when the customer is on site and they know that they're going to get a power cut. So here we go. And you'll probably hear a click. If you're on site doing this, you hear a click and that will be resetting the inverter. The remote firmware updates and also the remote programming for the inverter, kind of the reliability seems to depend on the reliability of the internet connection. So it may fail and you may have to try it again. And when you're doing the programming of the inverter, which I'll show you shortly, you need to you'll need to download the program again once you've uploaded it, just to make sure that everything's taken. Okay. So what it's done there is actually downloaded the application out of the inverter. So I'm now going to open this. Just clicking on it from the download folders will open up VE Configure 3 if you've got that installed on your laptop. It wants to open my other screen, so I'm going to shift it up here. It actually opens up initially the VE bus system configurator first. So you right click on that and then you go configure the multi VE configure. VE just stands for Victron Energy. And it will then open up the software called VE Configure 3. And this is the programming in the laptop, in the inverter. So you want to set the generator programming to be suitable for the generator. So I normally just put 10 amps in there, which is 2.5 kilowatts, and make sure that overruled, you click OK, overruled by remote is ticked. That means that you can overrule this current rating through the GX device. So that can be, they can go in through the screen, or you can do it now through the VRM portal as well. So I'll show you how to do that shortly. Enable the battery monitor. Pretty sure it's 200 amp hours because it's a 10.8 battery. It might be 300 amp hours. These are settings that are going to be used just in case the battery disconnects from the inverter. Sorry, I usually make that 95% for lithium. That's basically once it's reached its peak voltage, it automatically resets to 95%. Again, this won't make any difference at all unless someone disconnects the battery data cable from the inverter or from the GX device. Otherwise, the battery takes over and starts controlling anything to do with battery charging or discharging. It's off grid, so we're not going to feed energy from the grid. So we don't need a grid code. I untick UPS function. Basically, that's really handy for any generators that might be slightly dodgy, might give a dodgy waveform or something like that. The UPS function is really to try and make it, the inverter really finicky about the waveform, and when the generator turns off, it immediately disconnects it and goes back to inverting. So you only get maybe 20 milliseconds of a break, which is effectively one cycle. And so you'll hardly get any lights flicker or anything like that if you tick the UPS function. But if you untick it, it allows a wider range of generators with slightly dodgy waveforms to connect. So usually I would untick that. If you think it's a really good generator, you can leave it ticked and then you can untick it later on, but it means downloading the inverter and changing it. So now I'm going to go to Victron and Freedom One. And there's a web page on Victron Energy. There it is, Victron and Freedom One LiFePro batteries. And it tells you what settings you should have. You can read through that. Basically, there's the start. You'll notice that screen is there. So we just put those settings in. 47.0, 52.5, and 51.5. You can have power assist ticked or not. Depends if the inverter is quite small and you're running big loads and using the generator to support those big loads. Sorry, other way around. If your generator is quite small and it can't handle the big loads once it's connected, then you put power assist on and the inverter will actually assist the generator to run big loads. And when the big load turns off, the inverter will go back to charging using the generator to charge. Ground relay is normally ticked. That's creating an ME endpoint in the inverter. You can tick shut down state of charge if you want to. Normally for an off-grid system, I do. So I would go this is state of charge restart. So I'd go 21%, and then I want to shut it down at 20%. AES, don't enable that. Charger. Okay, so you can save a battery type once you've set up the battery, but for now, we'll just set it up manually. We're not in storage mode, so we're not keeping it fully charged for a long period of time. It's cycling in and out. So that's not storage. That's that's cyclic. So untick storage mode. Yes, we're using lithium batteries. We're going to use lithium iron phosphate, which is what you would tick unless you've already saved a Freedom 1 setting. So I'm going to go Freedom 1, click OK. Tells you what changes have been made, click OK. So there you can see it's changed to 55.8, 55.8. And if we scroll down on this website, that's the recommended voltages. So you can see it all there. Keep scrolling down. Virtual switch, do not use virtual switch. Assistance. So if you have a PV inverter on site, then you want to add an assistant for that. If you are connected to the grid and it's an ESS system, then you want to add an assistant for that as well. And there's all these assistants here that you can add an ESS for connected to the grid. PV inverter, if you've got a say a Fronius on the output, you'd select that, and that would then cause the inverter to frequency shift. Often I will select that anyway, because you want just in case someone puts some PV on it later on, or if you're not sure if there's PV going on to it, then at least you've got, that's the safest option. And even if it hasn't got a PV inverter and it lifts the frequency up, it really doesn't matter if it's going to lift a bit of frequency up. So start assistant. Saying, will the system make use of a VE bus BMS? No. So it's not a VE bus BMS. It's a VE CAN BMS. Inverter support, what are the frequencies? Just leave those at default. Basically, you're just going to run through now. Total installed PV inverter power is, and it just puts defaults in there. They really don't matter too much. We know that this is a 5 kilowatt inverter, so I can just put 5,000 watts of PV inverter, which is right up to the maximum, and then we'll say 5,000 watts of panels. But if you don't know, just put some arbitrary values in there. That doesn't really make a lot of difference to the performance. Now, if I go start assistant, I can add assistants like relays, for instance. So if I go to relay assistance, I can go programmable relay. Now, you may actually want to set up the programmable relay to liven up the AC2 output when the batteries are full. So we'll do that as an example. So we're using the AC2 output relay, which is a 230 volt output relay, which basically switches the inverter's AC output on or off on the second output. The first output on the inverter will just stay on all the time unless there's a problem. So we're going to set the relay on, and the rule we're going to use for this is state of charge, and it's going to turn on So we go turn it on. This is on state of charge up here. So turn it on when the state of charge is higher than say 98%. So when the battery is really full, this would be great for a hot water cylinder element. So now we've got a relay programmable relay assistant in there to turn the relay on. We also need one to turn the relay off. Otherwise it'll just turn on when it gets to 98% and never turn off. So start assistant again. Go through the options. We're going to use the AC2 out relay. And we're going to set the relay to off. And that's going to be based on state of charge. And when the state of charge is lower than, let's say, 95%. Basically, you want that element to turn off when there's not enough solar to keep up with running the element, but it needs to turn off before the percentage rating is too low for the system to last overnight. You wouldn't want to turn the element off at say 10% or 30% and only leave 10% left in the tank for the nighttime period. And that's it. You've got relays and PV inverter support. Now what you can do is hold control down, select them all and go summary. And that gives you a summary of all the assistance that you've got in there. So that is then done. So you click X and it will save itself. It'll ask if you want to save. Yes, I want to save it. Now be aware, due to certain changes in certain settings, it's going to turn off the inverter when the file is sent. Shut that down as well. Yes. It's asking me to save. This is not always going to ask you. This is just since we've done a firmware update. I'm going to save that. And it's saved in downloads, so I'll be able to find it easily. Save. Now go back to the VRM portal, go to device list, go to remote VE configure. It's going to find the inverter. Now, normally I would download this and do the programming changes that I've just done. But because I just did a firmware update, I don't need to download it. I've already had the file. I've had it open. I've done all the settings. I'm just going to upload it now. Select the file. And I should find that in downloads. I hover over it and just make sure that the date and time is close. So you can see down here, the bottom here of my screen, I've got 1:56 p.m. Just clicked over 1:56 p.m. And this file was last modified 1:55 p.m. So that is the file that we were just working on. And as you can see, if you've done a few, you'll notice that you've got lots of files there. You want to get the latest one. Double click on it. It's going to upload. That's around about when it turns the system off. Now, if your internet router is connected to the inverter, then you're going to lose comms at about this point, and you're going to have to wait for about 5 minutes before the system comes back online and starts communicating again, and then you'll be able to reconnect to it. But in this case, you were connected to your Wi-Fi hotspot on the phone, or if you've got a UPS on the internet router, which is quite a good idea to have sometimes, then you don't lose connection. So in this case, we haven't lost connection. Great success, right? Now, like I said before, you want to download it again, drag that program out of the inverter, and just go through the settings pages one at a time and make sure that all the settings look like what you have just programmed. If they don't, then make the changes, save the file, upload again, wait, download it again, just to make sure that it's taken, because if you've got a dodgy internet connection, it's possible that some of those settings won't have taken. So it's going to open it in VE Configure 3. Yep, 10 amps is in there. UPS is not ticked. I've got assistance. Charger voltages are good. My inverter disconnect voltages are good. Cool. So I can shut that and not worry about uploading it again. That is done. So that's your inverter programmed. Now we need to go through the two more things to program. One is the actual Servo GX, the remote console, remote access into that. Doesn't seem to be wanting me to connect. Sometimes if the internet is dodgy, it won't want you to connect. So then from on site, you then need to go into settings, general, disable password, and then reboot. And also make sure that remote access is available on the remote console, but we won't do that yet. What we'll do is we will forget about that, go back to normal Zoom. We're now going to go to Victron Connect. And we'll be looking for a customer name called Test, or whatever customer name you're looking for, whatever you're working on. So here's Victron Connect. So you've got local here. So if you're working locally with anything right next to you, sometimes it'll pick it up. And you've also got VRM, and we're on VRM. So I'm going to scroll down to Test. Doesn't seem to be there. So what we need to do now is we need to go through the let's have a look, see if I can reload that. We're going to need to go through the settings on the screen, at the screen, but let me just see if Test is there now. Yep, there it is. Okay, just had to refresh my VRM list. Now what it's done is it's noticed that it's got a MPPT charge controller connected to it, which is great. So I'm going to click on that. And then wait until the settings download. And this is a direct connection now to the charge controller. It's unlike what we did on the inverter, where we downloaded some the configuration and then made the changes and then uploaded it. This is actual real time. So if we go to battery, it's got battery voltage. Any changes we make here are going to be acknowledged by a little green tick. So if I go user defined, and then I go select preset, I'm going to start off by setting it to lithium iron phosphate, click OK. And you'll notice all these ticks come up. So it's automatically done some settings, but we also now need to go in and go, okay, we don't want it at 56.8, we want it at 55.8 volts for the Freedom One. And you see there it ticks it when it's done, and then 55.8 for float as well. And it ticks it and it's done. That means it's pushed up into the MPPT in real time. So that's made the change. Temperature compensation should always be disabled for lithium, and it's not allowed to charge below 5 degrees Celsius. And that's a battery temperature, not a environment temperature, so or an air temperature, because often the battery is several degrees warmer or cooler than the air temperature. It has quite a thermal delay. So if you have the temperature plummet to 0 degrees, the battery could take 4 or 5 hours before it gets there. Now, it's not allowed to charge below 0 degrees or below 5 degrees as a safety, but it can discharge. So what that means is, and also when a battery is discharging, the cells often get warm, and so they keep themselves warm. So very seldom are you going to see that limitation actually come into effect. So that is done. We have now programmed the charge controller. So I'm going to go into my own system here, and I'm going to show you how you can go through the remote console settings and what to check on the remote console settings. And so if you're on site, you can do this through the screen itself. Let me just get back out to the main menu. The main menu starts off with a device list, and then settings. And I just go through one step at a time. General, remote support should be on. And you'd see that it's online there as well. Firmware. This is firmware just for the console. And you can tell it to check and update the firmware, or you can tell it just to check it or not even check it. And you can press to check for the latest update. No newer version is available. That's great. So exit out of there, and date and time. It's pretty obvious. Just set up your region, which is Pacific, New Zealand, if you're in the Pacific, and if you're in New Zealand. Remote console. So do we want to enable this? So we click on disable password check. And then you're going to have to go back later on once you've changed all these settings and reboot the console under general. Enable on VRM, that means it's enabled, so you want to check that that's on, otherwise you can't access the remote console the way we are now, offline. I'm just going to zoom in on this a bit. And also, if you want the customer, or if you want yourself to be able to access it through the local area network through Windows, then enable that. If you don't want the customer to access it, then disable it. Then they can only access it through the screen. Quite handy if it's sort of like an Airbnb where people are logging onto the network. You really don't want them seeing that come up on network devices and double clicking it and having a play. That could kind of make things fail. System setup. Normally you want to have your battery monitor set up as the Freedom One or whatever battery you've got on there, or as the inverter. If you're unsure, then what you need to do is set it to automatic. And so if the battery gets disconnected, it'll jump back to the it'll jump back onto the inverter as its main battery monitor. So here it's saying auto selected, no battery found. So I'm just going to push it back, force it to go onto the inverter. But you'll see once you once you see there the Freedom 1 is plugged in, you'll see that that battery monitor will come up with Freedom 1. And you'll have the option to force it on Freedom 1 or just have it on auto. Normally your HAS DC system will be off, by the way. So you'll turn that off. That's just to calculate if something non-Victron is going on the network. It gives you a bit of functionality, just sort of calculates what that must be, whether it's a charger or an extra load coming straight off the battery. So normally you turn that off. On my home system, it's on. DVCC, that will be forced on. It will say here forced on, and that's by the battery. So you really don't need to worry about that, but just make sure that it's on. Display and language doesn't really matter. VRM online portal. You can use secure or not. It doesn't really matter. Log interval, I normally leave that at 1 minute, but if they've got really expensive internet, like satellite internet, or they're worried about it, you can change that to whatever rate you want. Just makes the data a bit more granular if you've got it at 1 minute. I normally set that for customers temporarily as well to 1 minute if we're doing fault finding, because we need to capture some data if there's problems going on like overloads or something like that. So just go, sorry, I've skipped past there. Go to VRM two-way communication, should be on. And I normally reboot the device after about an hour of no contact, only if it's connected to the internet. If it's not connected to the internet, then don't reboot it. It basically just means that if the internet gateway somehow boots the device off, it will reconnect itself. It'll try and reconnect itself by rebooting it. You don't want that enabled if you haven't got internet connected. You don't necessarily need it enabled either. ESS is for when you're connected to the grid. So you've got different ESS modes, but if it's off grid, this won't be showing up. You have to have an ESS assistant loaded in the inverter for this to show up. Energy meters, if you're using an energy meter for the grid or for a PV inverter that's not Fronius and you're monitoring it, then you can go in and scan for energy meters. Same PV inverters. What you want to do there is once your Fronius inverter is set up and running and connected to the network, you then go press to scan, and it will scan for PV inverters. And it will also show you if you've got any that it's picked up. Wireless AC sensors, don't worry about that. You're not going to be using that. Modbus TCP devices. Ethernet, it tells you if you're connected to the Ethernet port, what the address is, etc. And same with Wi-Fi. It tells you what Wi-Fi connections are available. Now, do not turn access point off while you're setting the system up. Otherwise, you lose your Wi-Fi connection back to the unit, and then you're forced to use Ethernet. So be careful not to turn that off during the setup period. You can turn it off if you want to, again, for the customer not to have to see the access point, then you can turn it off and the customer, it won't come up on their device when they're looking for Wi-Fi networks. A lot of things there we don't need to worry about. Services. We want the BMS CAN port to be on 500. Okay, so it's disabled here on my one because I don't have a CAN, but you select it, CAN 500 kilobits. If you've got two CAN ports, there's no problem with turning them both on to 500, which the Serbo GX has 2 ports. And that is about it. Then don't forget to go back up, go to General, and go to Reboot, and reboot the unit, and it'll boot you out as soon as you reboot it. There we go, gone.